Friendship attrition is one of the quietest and least examined forms of loss. It doesn't arrive with the clean grief of a breakup or the closure of an explicit ending. It arrives at a distance, a gradual thinning of contact, the message that takes longer to reply to and eventually stops getting sent, the plans that keep not quite materializing, the person who was once a consistent presence in your life becoming, incrementally, someone you used to be close to. And the person on the receiving end of this slow withdrawal is almost always left without an explanation. Not because their friend decided to end things, but because the drift was never narrated by anyone. It simply happened. And in the absence of an explanation, most people land on the same uncomfortable question: was it something I did? The answer, in many cases, is yes. But not in the way that question implies. Not a moment of bad judgment or an obvious mistake. Something subtler. Something operating below the level of deliberate behavior, in the automatic patterns that most people have never examined, and therefore never recognized as the mechanism producing the outcome they can't explain. Psychology is unambiguous on this. The quality of our relationships is shaped more significantly by our unconscious interpersonal habits than by our conscious intentions. We can genuinely like someone, genuinely want to maintain a friendship, genuinely mean well in every interaction, and still be doing things, automatically and invisibly, that gradually make the other person feel less connected to us than they did before. And because these things operate below awareness, they can continue indefinitely, without the person ever knowing they are happening. These are 5 of them. The first is the subtle pattern of redirecting attention back to yourself in the exact moment a friend most needs to be received. This is not the dramatic version, the obvious self-absorption, where someone literally interrupts and changes the subject. It is the quieter version that is almost universally present in the people who do it. The brief validation that sounds really hard, followed immediately by a pivot to personal experience. Something similar happened to me when. The pivot is not malicious. It is almost always motivated by the genuine impulse to demonstrate empathy through shared experience. But what the friend on the other end receives is not a demonstration of understanding. It is the experience of having offered something about themselves and receiving, in return, a conversation about you. And over time, the cumulative effect of this pattern is that they stop bringing the real things, because the real things keep becoming occasions for your experiences rather than spaces for theirs. The second subtle thing is being inconsistently available in a way that trains the other person to hold their expectations low. This is one of the most damaging patterns in friendship precisely because it is also one of the most easily rationalized. You are busy. Life is full. You don't always respond quickly. You sometimes cancel. And none of these individual instances is a significant relational event. But the cumulative pattern, the sense that reaching out to you has a lower than average probability of producing genuine connection, is significant. People's brains maintain an implicit model of how reliable each relationship in their life is. And when that model gets updated, repeatedly, in the direction of lower reliability, the rational response is to reach out less. Not out of resentment, out of self-protection from the investment of energy that might not be returned. The friendship doesn't end. It simply starts to operate at a lower level of expectation, from which it rarely recovers. The third subtle thing is offering advice instead of presence, when presence is what was needed. This is perhaps the most well-intentioned item on this list, and the one that causes the most consistent relational frustration. When a friend brings you a difficulty, a problem they're struggling with, an experience they're processing, the default response of many people is solution generation. They hear the problem, and they begin immediately constructing the answer, and this response feels, from the inside, like caring. I like helping, like the concrete manifestation of wanting things to be better for the other person. What the other person frequently experiences is something quite different. The feeling that the difficulty was treated as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be witnessed. Research on social support quality consistently finds that the kind of support people report most valuing in close relationships is not instrumental help, but emotional validation, the experience of being heard, understood, and not immediately steered toward a resolution. When that is consistently absent, the friend learns to bring only the things they need solutions for, which is rarely the things that actually matter most. If any of this is landing somewhere in you, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find conversations like this one. And if understanding the specific unconscious patterns shaping your friendships is something you want more of, subscribing makes that work possible. The fourth subtle thing is competing without knowing you're competing. Not in the obvious sense of trying to one-up a friend's accomplishments, but in the subtler sense of having an automatic comparison orientation that registers in conversation. When a friend shares something good that has happened to them, there is a version of response that engages with their news as its own thing, that asks follow-up questions, that stays in the territory of what they experienced, that gives their moment its own space. And there is another version that registers the information through the filter of how it compares to your own life, that adds a qualifying comment, or pivots to something you've also achieved, or responds with something that subtly repositions the conversational territory toward parity. The person doing this almost never knows they're doing it. But the friend on the receiving end, over time, begins to feel that their good news isn't quite safe to share, that sharing it will produce a response that is technically positive, but doesn't quite celebrate them without complicating it. The fifth subtle thing is letting the friendship operate on inertia rather than intention. This is the most passive item on the list and the most common. Friendships, like all relationships, require periodic renewal. Small, consistent acts of deliberate investment that signal to the other person that the connection is maintained not just by habit, but by choice. When these acts of deliberate investment stop, when the friendship is sustained only by the momentum of its own history, only by showing up when the other person initiates, only by responding but never reaching, the friendship begins to feel, to the person who is doing the sustaining, like something they are responsible for keeping alive alone. And people consistently, correctly, eventually stop sustaining things they feel responsible for maintaining unilaterally. The friendship doesn't end because they stop caring. It ends because they stop having enough evidence that the caring is mutual. Here is the paradox that holds all 5 of these patterns together. Every one of them is the behavior of someone who cares about connection. The redirection is an attempt to demonstrate empathy. The inconsistent availability is a failure to prioritize, not a failure to value. The advice is an expression of wanting things to be better. The subtle competition is often a form of anxiety about one's own worth rather than diminishment of another's. And inertia is often the byproduct of a life that is genuinely full rather than a friendship that is genuinely unvalued. The problem is not caring. The problem is the gap between the caring and how the caring is being expressed, a gap that produces, in the other person, a consistent experience of being slightly less important than they'd expected to be. And that experience, accumulated across hundreds of small interactions, becomes the explanation for the distance that nobody ever named. Friendships are maintained not by grand gestures, but by the quality of ordinary attention. And the most important question in any friendship is not whether you care, it is whether the other person can feel that you do. Which of these 5 patterns do you recognize in yourself, and is there a friendship that might deserve a different quality of attention than it's currently receiving? Hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.